The bitter Chicago wind blew open the diner doors, bringing in two shivering little girls clutching a torn, blood-stained designer coat. With no parents and no money, they were freezing. When Alara offered them a warm meal, she didn't know she was harboring a ruthless mafia boss's daughters, or the deadly consequences to follow. The blizzard of February 2026 was unforgiving, burying Chicago under a suffocating blanket of white. Inside the Starlight Diner, an old 24-hour joint nestled beneath the rumbling tracks of the L train on Wabash Avenue, 24-year-old Alara Jenkins was wiping down the laminate counters for the fourth time. The diner smelled perpetually of stale coffee, industrial bleach, and frying grease. Alara's back ached, her worn-out Converse sneakers soaked through from her trek to work. She was working a double shift, desperately trying to chip away at the crushing $40,000 debt her ex-boyfriend had left in her name with a notoriously violent West Loop loan shark known only as Bones Harrison. It was 2:15 a.m. The neon open sign buzzed in the window, casting a sickly red glow across the empty booths. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors violently swung inward, accompanied by a howling gust of wind and a spray of snow. Alara dropped her rag, startled. Standing in the entryway were two little girls. They looked entirely out of place in the gritty neighborhood. The older girl, perhaps 8 years old, had her arm wrapped protectively around a toddler who couldn't be more than 4. They were shivering uncontrollably. The older girl wore a torn, mud-splattered Montclair puffer jacket, the luxury fabric slashed at the shoulder. The younger girl was wrapped in a man's heavy, blood-stained suit jacket that trailed on the wet linoleum floor. Hey, it's okay," Alara said, her voice soft as she hurried out from behind the counter. She locked the heavy deadbolt on the front door behind them, instinctively sensing danger. "Where are your parents, sweethearts?" The older girl looked up, her dark eyes wide and terrified. Her face was smudged with soot and tears. "We had to run," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "Uncle Leo said to run into the snow. He didn't come with us." Alara's maternal instincts, honed by years of raising her younger siblings, kicked into overdrive. She didn't reach for the phone to call the police, not yet. The blood on the jacket and the sheer terror in the girl's eyes told her this wasn't a simple case of getting lost. "Come here. Let's get you warm," Alara urged. She guided them to the booth furthest from the windows, practically hidden behind the swinging kitchen doors. She rushed to the employee break room, grabbing her own heavy fleece blanket and a portable space heater, plugging it in near their frozen feet. She quickly whipped up 2 plates of scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and 2 large mugs of hot chocolate piled high with whipped cream. When she set the food down, the younger girl attacked the eggs ravenously. The older girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the diner's windows. "My name is Alara," she said, sliding into the opposite side of the booth. "What are your names?" "I'm Sophia," the older girl said, her voice shaking as she finally took a sip of the hot chocolate. "This is Mia. It's nice to meet you, Sophia. Do you know a phone number I can call? For your mom or dad?" Sophia shook her head violently. "No police. Uncle Leo said the police work for the bad men. He said my papa will find us. But we have to hide from the black cars." Alara's stomach plummeted. As she reached out to tuck the blanket tighter around Mia, she noticed a heavy, smashed GPS tracking watch on Sophia's wrist and a silver necklace bearing a distinct family crest, a roaring lion holding a dagger. Alara wasn't deeply involved in the criminal underworld, but living in Chicago and dealing with loan sharks, you heard whispers. The lion and dagger was the crest of the Valenti syndicate, a ruthless, old-money mafia family that practically owned the city's docks and real estate. Before Alara could process the gravity of who she was sheltering, the diner's front windows were illuminated by the harsh, sweeping headlights of a massive vehicle. Alara peeked over the vinyl booth. A sleek, black Lincoln Navigator had just rolled into the snow-filled parking lot, its engine a low, menacing purr. Sophia saw the lights and grabbed Alara's arm, her small fingers digging into Ilara's skin with terrifying strength. "They found us," Sophia gasped, tears spilling over her cheeks. "Please, don't let them take Mia." "I won't," Ilara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hoisted Mia into her arms and grabbed Sophia's hand. "Quick, into the kitchen." She pushed them through the swinging doors and led them to the dry storage pantry in the back. It was a cramped, windowless room filled with towering boxes of canned tomatoes, flour sacks, and bulk coffee. Ilara shoved 3 heavy crates of flour aside, revealing a small, dark crawl space near the floorboards where the diner's old ventilation system used to be. "Get in," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear out there. I promise I will come get you." Sophia nodded, pulling Mia into the dusty dark. Ilara shoved the flour crates back into place, completely concealing the gap. Just as she sprinted back out to the front counter, the deadbolt on the front door clicked. Someone was picking the lock. A second later, the door swung open, bringing the freezing storm inside once again. 2 men stepped into the Starlight Diner. They didn't look like standard street thugs. They wore tailored black overcoats dusted with snow, leather gloves, and carried themselves with the chilling, quiet confidence of professional killers. The taller of the 2 had a jagged, pink scar running from his jaw to his collarbone. Ilara snatched a coffee pot and a rag, forcing her shaking hands to steady as she wiped down the counter. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," she called out, projecting a customer service cheerfulness she did not feel. "Grill is closed for deep cleaning until 5 a.m. I can only offer coffee." The scarred man walked slowly toward the counter, his dark eyes scanning the empty diner. He didn't look at Ilara. He looked at the floor. He was tracking the faint, wet footprints the girls had left on the linoleum. "Coffee sounds fine," the man said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any warmth. He sat on a stool directly in front of Ilara. His partner walked down the aisle, peering over the tops of the vinyl booths. Ilara poured the coffee, accidentally spilling a few drops on the saucer. "Terrible weather out there," she babbled, trying to distract him from the footprints that faded near the kitchen doors. "City should have plowed Wabash hours ago." The scarred man ignored her small talk. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, suppressed handgun, setting it casually on the laminate counter next to his coffee cup. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "We're looking for 2 little girls," the man said softly, his eyes finally meeting hers. "They were dead. Empty eyes. Runaways. Might have slipped in here to get out of the cold. You seen 'em?" "Girls." Ilara forced a confused laugh. "Mister, the only people I've seen since midnight was a drunk guy asking for directions to the interstate and a trucker who left about 20 minutes ago. If 2 kids were out in this blizzard, they'd freeze to death." The second man suddenly paused by the booth the girls had occupied minutes prior. Ilara had cleared the plates, but she had missed something. "Hey, Silas," the second man called out. He picked up the heavy, blood-stained suit jacket Ilara had draped over the back of the booth. "Look at this." Silas picked up his gun, sliding it back into his coat, and walked over to the booth. He inspected the jacket, rubbing the luxurious wool between his gloved fingers. He looked back at Ilara, his expression turning lethal. "You said only a trucker and a drunk were in here," Silas said, stepping slowly toward the counter. "This is a bespoke Brioni jacket. Costs about $8,000. You expect me to believe a trucker left this behind?" Ilara's mind raced, adrenaline flooding her veins. "The drunk guy." She lied smoothly, staring right back into Silas's eyes despite the sheer terror radiating through her body. He was wearing it. He threw up all over the bathroom floor, came out, said the coat was ruined, and left it there. "You can go check the bathroom if you want, but I warn you, I haven't mopped it yet." Silas stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He was trying to read her, trying to find the crack in her story. He took a step toward the kitchen doors. Ilara's blood turned to ice. If he went back there, he would tear the place apart. Before Silas could push the swinging doors open, The harsh, blaring wail of police sirens pierced the howling wind outside. Red and blue lights flashed frantically against the diner's frosted windows. Silas stopped. He cursed under his breath in Italian. His partner tapped the glass, looking out into the parking lot. "Chicago PD," the partner hissed. "3 cruisers heading down Wabash. They're locking down the grid." Valenti must have called in his favors. Silas turned back to Alara. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, white business card, tossing it onto the counter. It read, "Apex Import and Export, a front." Written in pen on the back was a phone number. "If those kids come in here, or if you remember something else about that drunk," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "you call this number. There is a $50,000 reward, but if I find out you lied to me, I'll come back here and burn this place to the ground with you inside it. Understand? Crystal clear." Alara choked out. The men hurried out the door, jumping into the Navigator. The SUV's tires spun in the snow before tearing out of the parking lot, disappearing into the blizzard just as the police cruisers sped past the diner. Alara collapsed against the counter, her knees giving out. She sobbed, taking deep, gasping breaths. She waited 10 full minutes, watching the empty, snow-blown street, before she finally pushed herself up and ran to the back pantry. She pulled the heavy crates of flour away. "Sophia? Mia? It's okay. They're gone." The girls crawled out. Mia was crying silently, and Sophia looked paler than a ghost. Alara pulled them both into a desperate hug. "You're safe," she whispered. "I've got you." For the rest of the night, Alara locked the diner down. She made a bed of aprons and tablecloths in the manager's locked office, sitting guard by the door with a heavy cast-iron skillet in her lap. She didn't sleep a wink. By 7 a.m., the storm had broken, leaving behind a blindingly bright, frozen city. Alara was making the girls pancakes when the low, synchronized hum of multiple heavy engines vibrated through the diner's floorboards. Alara looked out the window. Her breath hitched. The parking lot was completely surrounded. 4 armored Cadillac Escalades had boxed in the diner, blocking every possible exit. Men in dark suits and heavy overcoats stepped out. At least a dozen of them, all visibly armed. But it wasn't the men from last night. From the center vehicle emerged a man who commanded the space around him like a king surveying a war zone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and fiercely handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and dark hair slightly silvering at the temples. He wore a dark wool overcoat, but he looked entirely immune to the freezing cold. His eyes, dark and piercing, carried a level of grief and barely contained violence that made Alara's heart stutter. It was Alessandro Valenti, the boss of the Valenti family, the most feared man in the Chicago underworld, and he was walking straight toward the front door of the diner. The heavy glass door of the Starlight Diner didn't just open. It was shoved inward with a force that rattled the frosted windows in their frames. Alara stood frozen behind the laminate counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the heavy cast-iron skillet. The air in the diner seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. Alessandro Valenti stepped inside, followed closely by 2 massive men in tailored charcoal suits, their hands resting ominously inside their coat jackets. Alessandro didn't look like a common street thug. He exuded wealth, power, and a terrifying, cold-blooded authority. His dark wool coat was dusted with snow, and his expensive Italian leather shoes clicked sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. He scanned the empty diner, his dark, bloodshot eyes settling instantly on Alara. "Where are they?" His voice was a low, resonant baritone, quiet but vibrating with absolute command. It wasn't a question. It was an order. Alara swallowed the lump of pure terror in her throat. She stepped out from behind the counter, keeping herself firmly positioned between the imposing Mafia boss and the locked door of the manager's office. "The diner is closed, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The 2 bodyguards shifted, but Alessandro raised a single, gloved hand, halting them instantly. He stepped closer to Alara. Up close, the sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. He smelled of crisp winter air, expensive bergamot cologne, and gun oil. "I am not a patient man, miss," Alessandro said, his gaze locking onto hers. "My name is Alessandro Valenti. I have torn half of Chicago apart tonight. I know my daughter's GPS tracker went offline 2 blocks from here. I know my men found a bloody scrap of my brother's coat on the corner of Wabash and 14th. If you are hiding them, you are either very brave or very foolish. Where are my children?" Before Alara could decide whether to lie or surrender, a small, muffled voice drifted from behind the office door. "Papa?" Alessandro's entire demeanor shattered. The cold, untouchable Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a desperate, terrified father. He practically shoved past Alara, dropping to his knees on the dirty floor right outside the office door. "Sophia? Gatina, is that you?" "It's Papa." "I'm here." Alara quickly fished the key from her apron and unlocked the door. The moment it clicked open, Sophia and Mia burst out. Sophia threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, while little Mia buried her face in his neck. Alessandro Valenti, the man who owned the Chicago underworld, buried his face in his daughter's hair, his broad shoulders shaking. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely, kissing their heads repeatedly. "Papa's here. Nobody is going to hurt you ever again." Alara stepped back, giving them space, her own eyes welling with tears. She lowered the cast-iron skillet to the counter. After several long minutes, Alessandro stood up, lifting Mia into his left arm while keeping Sophia tucked tightly against his side. The lethal coldness returned to his eyes as he looked over his daughters and saw they were unharmed, wearing dry clothes fashioned from diner aprons, and smelled faintly of maple syrup. He turned his piercing gaze back to Alara. "Who else was here?" Alara took a deep breath. "2 men, about 4 hours ago. One was tall, wearing a black overcoat, had a jagged pink scar down his neck. The other called him Silas. They were looking for the girls." A dangerous silence fell over the diner. Alessandro's right-hand man, a heavily built enforcer named Dominic, stepped forward, his expression grim. "Silas," Dominic muttered, "Leo's top dog." So, Leo really did orchestrate the hit at the estate. "My own brother," Alessandro said, the words dripping with venom. He looked at Alara, noticing for the first time how small and exhausted she looked. He saw her worn-out Converse sneakers, the dark circles under her eyes, and the bruising on her knuckles from working brutal double shifts. "Silas is a butcher. If he was here, how are you still breathing? How are my daughters alive?" "I hid them," Alara said simply, gesturing toward the back pantry. "I shoved them in a ventilation crawlspace behind the flour crates. I told the man with the scar that a drunk had left the bloody jacket behind. He didn't believe me, but the police drove by and spooked them." She reached into her pocket and slid the crisp, white business card across the counter. "Apex Import and Export. He told me to call this number if the girls showed up. Said there was a $50,000 reward." Alessandro picked up the card, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He looked from the card to Alara. "You lied to Silas. You risked your life for 2 strangers. Why?" Alara shrugged, wrapping her arms around herself. "They were freezing, and they were just little girls. I couldn't let monsters take them." As she spoke, her phone, sitting on the counter by the register, lit up with a harsh buzz. The cracked screen displayed a text message in large, glaring letters. Sender: Bones Harrison. Message: 40K by Friday, Alara. Or I send my boys to break your knees and take it out of your pretty face. Don't make me come to the diner. Alessandro's sharp eyes caught the message before the screen faded to black. He didn't say a word about it, but Alara saw the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Dominic," Alessandro barked. "Get the girls into the armored transport. Heat on maximum." "Yes, boss." Dominic gently ushered the 2 girls out the door into the waiting fortress of SUVs. Alessandro lingered behind, He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy money clip, thick with $100 bills, tossing it onto the counter. "For the pancakes," he said softly. Then, he stepped closer to Alara, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. "You saved my blood today, Alara. The Valenti family does not forget a debt." With that, he turned and walked out into the freezing morning sun, leaving Alara alone in the empty diner. 3 days passed. The blizzard melted into a slushy, gray Chicago nightmare. For Alara, the adrenaline of that night had faded, replaced by a suffocating dread. Friday had arrived. She had managed to scrape together $800 from her tips and begging her landlord for an extension on rent, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the $40,000 she owed Bones Harrison. Her ex-boyfriend, Tommy, a low-level hustler, had taken the loan in her name to buy into a stolen car ring before vanishing completely. Now, Bones was holding Alara responsible. At 11:30 p.m., Alara was locking up the Starlight Diner. The street was quiet, the L train rumbling distantly overhead. She pulled her thin coat tight, bracing for the walk to her apartment in Pilsen. "Going somewhere, Alara?" Alara froze. Stepping out from the shadows of the alleyway beside the diner was Bones Harrison. He was a terrifyingly large man with gold teeth and a baseball bat resting casually against his shoulder. Flanking him were 2 of his enforcers, grinning like hungry wolves. "Bones," Alara breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. I have 800. I can get you more next week. I swear. I just need—" "I don't do payment plans anymore, sweetheart," Bones interrupted, stepping into the dim light of the street lamp. He raised the bat, tapping it lightly against his palm. "Tommy screwed me. You're gonna pay for it. Grab her." The 2 enforcers lunged forward, grabbing Alara by her arms. She screamed, thrashing wildly, but they were too strong. They dragged her toward the dark alley. Suddenly, the screech of heavy tires shattered the quiet night. 2 matte black Cadillac Escalades jumped the curb, their high beams blinding Bones and his men. The vehicles slammed on their brakes, effectively boxing them into the alley. The doors flew open simultaneously. Half a dozen men in dark suits stepped out, drawing suppressed weapons with terrifying synchronization. They didn't yell. They didn't posture. They simply aimed. The enforcers holding Alara immediately dropped her, throwing their hands in the air, their faces draining of color. Bones dropped his baseball bat, the wood clattering loudly against the freezing asphalt. The back door of the lead Escalade opened. Alessandro Valenti stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. He looked immaculate, wearing a tailored black suit and a long cashmere overcoat. He walked slowly toward the group, his eyes locked on Bones Harrison. The raw, predatory aura surrounding him made Bones physically shrink backward. "Mr. Valenti," Bones stammered, his voice cracking. I didn't know this was your territory. We were just leaving." Alessandro stopped 2 feet away from the loan shark. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You hold a marker on Alara Jenkins." Bones swallowed hard, sweating despite the cold. It's just business, Mr. Valenti." "Her ex, Tommy. He took 40 grand from me." "Tommy is dead," Alessandro stated coldly. Alara gasped, but Alessandro didn't look at her. "He was working for my treacherous brother, Leo. He used your money to fund a hit on my family. A hit that failed." Alessandro gestured lazily with 2 fingers. Dominic stepped forward, carrying a heavy black duffel bag. He dropped it at Bones's feet. It hit the ground with a heavy metallic thud. "There is your 40,000, Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, plus an extra 100,000. "Because as of tonight, I am buying your entire operation. Every debt you own, every marker you hold, now belongs to the Valenti family. If you or your men ever come within a 10-mile radius of Miss Jenkins again, I will personally see to it that they never find your bodies. Do we have an understanding?" Bones nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. We're gone." He didn't even grab the bag. He and his men turned and sprinted down the alley, disappearing into the dark. Alessandro finally turned his attention to Elara. She was sitting on the icy concrete, trembling from head to toe. He closed the distance between them, removing his expensive cashmere overcoat and draping it gently over her shivering shoulders. The warmth and the scent of bergamot enveloped her. He reached out a gloved hand and helped her to her feet. "You're safe," Alessandro murmured, his dark eyes softening as he looked down at her. "Your debt is erased." He pulled a thick, manila envelope from his suit jacket and placed it in her hands. "I also took the liberty of purchasing the Starlight Diner from your former boss. The deed is in your name. You are no longer a waitress, Elara. You are an owner." Elara stared at the envelope, her mind short-circuiting. I can't accept this. This is too much." "You saved my daughters," Alessandro said, stepping closer. The intensity in his gaze made Elara's breath hitch. "There is no price too high for that." He gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering for a fraction of a second on her cold cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. However, Alessandro's voice darkened, a shadow passing over his handsome face. "There is a complication. My brother Leo has gone to ground. And Silas. Silas knows your face. He knows you lied to him. Until I hunt them down and eliminate the threat, you are a loose end they might try to exploit." Alessandro stepped back, signaling his men. "Dominic is going to pack your things. You aren't staying in Pilsen tonight. You are coming with me to the estate, under my protection." Elara clutched the envelope to her chest, her world spinning out of control. In less than a week, she had gone from a drowning waitress to the owner of a diner, completely debt-free, and now she was being swept into the heavily guarded, opulent, and deadly world of a Mafia kingpin. The Valenti estate was a sprawling, Gothic revival fortress hidden behind massive wrought-iron gates and ancient oak trees on Sheridan Road in Lake Forest, Illinois. For Elara, stepping out of the armored SUV and looking up at the imposing stone facade was like crossing into another universe. She had traded the gritty, exhaust-choked streets of the South Loop for manicured lawns sloping down to the icy shores of Lake Michigan. Her accommodations were a master suite in the East Wing, draped in heavy silk curtains and out-tifted with a massive 4-poster bed covered in pristine fret linens. But despite the luxury, it was a gilded cage. Armed guards in tailored suits patrolled the hallways, and the perimeter was locked down tighter than a Federal Reserve. For the first 2 weeks, Elara fell into a bizarre but comforting routine. She became a surrogate mother to Sophia and Mia. The trauma of their uncle's betrayal and their mother's death, which Elara soon learned had been an earlier, successful assassination orchestrated by Leo, had left the girls plagued by night terrors. Elara spent her nights sitting by their beds, brushing their hair and whispering stories until they fell asleep. Alessandro was a ghost during the day, consumed by a brutal, invisible war. The Chicago underworld was bleeding as he systematically dismantled his brother's remaining loyalists, but at night he would return. One evening in late March, Elara found herself in the estate's sprawling, mahogany-paneled library. The fire was roaring in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the thousands of leather-bound books. She was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and leggings, a stark contrast to the opulence around her. The heavy double doors creaked open. Alessandro walked in, looking utterly exhausted. He had shed his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of a sprawling family crest tattooed over his heart. He poured himself a measure of Macallan 25 from a crystal decanter and collapsed into a leather wingback chair opposite Elara. "You look tired," Elara noted softly, closing the novel she was reading. Alessandro let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "War is exhausting, Elara, especially when the enemy shares your blood." He took a slow sip of the amber liquid, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Mia told me you made them hot chocolate from scratch today." Not the powdered garbage the chefs buy. She said it tasted like the diner. Elara smiled, a faint blush warming her cheeks. It's the little things. They need normalcy right now, Alessandro. Not bodyguards and bulletproof glass. He set his glass down on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. He stood, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps until he was towering over her. Elara looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They need you," Alessandro murmured, his voice dropping an octave. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "I need you." The air in the library grew thick, charged with an undeniable, electric tension. Elara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, the warmth of his hand sending a shiver down her spine. "Alessandro," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I have spent my entire life building an empire of fear," he said, his forehead resting against hers, his breath mingling with hers. "I thought my heart died with my wife. But then I saw you, standing behind that diner counter, armed with nothing but a frying pan, ready to die for 2 children you didn't even know. You are the bravest woman I have ever met." He didn't wait for her to reply. He captured her lips with a desperate, consuming hunger. Elara gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his broad shoulders. The kiss was a collision of 2 vastly different worlds, a ruthless kingpin and a resilient survivor. It was raw, fiercely possessive, and tasted of expensive scotch and dangerous promises. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. "I won't let anything happen to you," he vowed, against her lips. "Tomorrow, I end this. I have a location on Leo, but the devil, as they say, is always in the details." The following afternoon, while Alessandro was leading an assault team on a warehouse in Cicero, Elara received a frantic phone call. It was a man claiming to be a Cook County building inspector. He aggressively informed her that a massive gas leak had been detected beneath the Starlight Diner, and if the registered owner didn't arrive with the security codes to the basement vault immediately, the city would bulldoze the property to prevent an explosion. Panic seized Elara. The diner was her only tangible asset, her fresh start. Without thinking, she grabbed Dominic, who had been left behind to guard the estate. "We have to go," Elara insisted, sprinting toward the garage. "It's a city emergency." Dominic hesitated, his hand resting on his earpiece. "The boss said no one leaves the perimeter. I can't reach his secure line. He's in a dead zone." "Dominic, they are going to level my business in 20 minutes. Just drive me there. I'll punch in the code, and we'll come straight back." 2 armored cars. "Please." Reluctantly, Dominic agreed. They piled into 2 black Escalades and sped down the highway toward the South Loop. The sky above Chicago was bruised and gray, threatening a heavy spring downpour. When they arrived at the Starlight Diner on Wabash Avenue, the street was eerily deserted. No fire trucks, no city workers. Just the flashing yellow light of a broken street lamp. "Stay in the car," Dominic barked, drawing his Glock 19. He and 2 other guards stepped out, their eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways. Something is wrong. Suddenly, the sharp, suppressed thwip-thwip of sniper fire shattered the silence. The front tires of both Escalades blew out simultaneously. Before Dominic could react, a tear gas canister crashed through the diner's front window, flooding the street with thick, blinding white smoke. "Ambush!" Dominic roared, returning fire blindly into the smoke. "Elara, get down!" The back door of Elara's SUV was violently yanked open. A heavy, gloved hand grabbed her by the hair, dragging her out onto the freezing, wet asphalt. She screamed, kicking wildly, but a massive arm locked around her throat, choking off her air. As the smoke began to clear, Elara found herself staring at the diner's neon sign, a cold, steel barrel pressed firmly against her temple. "Hello again, sweetheart." The voice was gravelly and dead. Elara forced her eyes open, her vision swimming. It was Silas. The jagged pink scar on his neck stood out starkly against his pale skin. He was using her as a human shield. In front of them, Dominic and the remaining guard were pinned down behind the blown-out SUV, bleeding but alive, their weapons aimed squarely at Silas's head. "Drop the guns, or the waitress gets a new piercing," Silas snarled, cocking the hammer of his pistol. Dominic's jaw clenched. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. "Leo sends his regards." Silas sneered, his breath hot against Ilara's ear. "You thought you could hide from us? You thought the great Alessandro Valenti could protect you? He's currently walking into a rigged warehouse in Cicero. By the time I put a bullet in your head, the boss will be nothing but ash." Ilara's blood ran cold. Alessandro. She refused to let him die. She refused to let Sofia and Mia be orphaned twice. Summoning every ounce of street-hardened grit she had developed over the years, Ilara stomped her heel down with bone-shattering force, driving her boot directly into Silas's instep. As he flinched, she slammed her elbow backward, catching him squarely in the ribs. Silas cursed, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Ilara threw herself forward, hitting the wet pavement. In that exact microsecond, a deafening roar echoed down Wabash Avenue. It wasn't Dominic who fired. A sleek, heavily armored black Maybach tore around the corner, its engine screaming. The passenger door kicked open while the car was still moving at 40 miles an hour. Alessandro Valenti stepped onto the running board, a heavily modified assault rifle in his hands. His eyes were entirely black, devoid of anything human. He was the devil himself, come to collect. Silas raised his pistol toward Ilara, but he never even pulled the trigger. Alessandro fired a 3-round burst. The bullets hit Silas dead in the chest, the kinetic force lifting the massive hitman off his feet and throwing him backward through the shattered glass doors of the Starlight Diner. The Maybach slammed on its brakes. Alessandro threw the rifle into the back seat and sprinted toward Ilara. He dropped to his knees on the broken glass and wet pavement, hauling her into his arms. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her for blood. He was hyperventilating, his custom suit ruined, his hands shaking violently. "Ilara, look at me. Are you hit?" "I'm okay," she sobbed, burying her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of gunpowder and bergamot. "I'm okay," Silas said. "He said you were walking into a trap." Leo tried. Alessandro snarled, pressing his lips to her forehead. He failed. "Dominic, secure the perimeter. Call the cleaners." He picked Ilara up effortlessly, carrying her away from the carnage and into the safety of his vehicle. As the adrenaline faded, Ilara looked up at the terrifying, beautiful man who had just torn the city apart to save her. "You came back," she whispered. "I will always come back for you," Alessandro vowed, his dark eyes fierce and uncompromising. "The war is over, Ilara. Leo is dead. Silas is dead. No one will ever threaten you again." He pulled her into a deep, desperate kiss, ignoring the sirens wailing in the distance. The police would come, the city would panic, but Alessandro owned the shadows, and he would ensure they were never touched by the law. Months later, the Starlight Diner was beautifully renovated. Not just a business, but a symbol of where it all began. Ilara stood behind the gleaming mahogany counter, not wearing a waitress uniform, but a stunning silk dress, a diamond ring the size of a small boulder resting heavy on her left hand. Sofia and Mia were sitting in the corner booth, laughing as they ate towering stacks of pancakes, and leaning against the register, watching Ilara with an expression of pure, unadulterated devotion, was the king of Chicago himself. She had traded a life of debt for a life of danger, but in the arms of the Mafia boss, Ilara had finally found her home. Ilara's harrowing choice to shelter 2 desperate children transformed her life from a cycle of endless debt into a sweeping, dangerous romance. By standing up to the shadows of the Chicago underworld, she didn't just save Alessandro Valenti's daughters. She healed his fractured heart. In the end, courage forged an unbreakable bond, proving that sometimes the most unexpected families are built from the ashes of the darkest storms.